Good evening, everyone, and may I offer you some very hearty greetings from a very cold and rainy Aberdeen. I hope you're all keeping well and slowly getting into the Christmas spirit. And of course, that's partly the intention, actually, of tonight's discussion. I'm going to give a short presentation about Charles Dickens and his associations with Christmas. And I'm also going to try and think about what it is about A Christmas Carol that has made it so enduringly appealing. I'm going to sort of think about also why so many adaptations of A Christmas Carol exist. It's one of the most adapted literary texts, perhaps. And certainly at this time of the year, we automatically almost turn our attention to this classic tale by Charles Dickens. And it's probably fair to say that Charles Dickens as an individual has had possibly more influence than anyone else upon the way that we think about the Christmas festivities. Some have even claimed that Charles Dickens invented Christmas. I'm a little bit skeptical of that claim myself. I think a lot of the traditions that we associate with Christmas certainly spring from the Victorian era. And as some of you may already know, Prince Albert, of course, was responsible for introducing a good many of them into our lives, and we still cling to them today. Many of these Christmas traditions and customs. But Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is perhaps the seminal Christmas story. It's a as I say, an enduringly popular text, and it's very much a cultural reference point that is constantly adaptable for different ages and for different historical moments. Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol is kind of interesting because it's rooted firmly in the climate of the 1840s. Charles Dickens wrote Christmas Carol in 1843, and it's undoubtedly one of Dickens' most popular works. Of course, most of you will be familiar with it. Most of you will be able to find your way around the Christmas Carol without me giving a detailed plot summary. But of course, the key thing about A Christmas Carol is that it tells the tale of Ebenezer Scrooge, who of course is a greedy miser who expresses a deep loathing of this most festive period of the year. Crucially, however, Scrooge, as we know, is transformed during the course of the narrative into somebody who is the polar opposite of the character that we initially encounter. And this transformation perhaps lies at the very heart of the story's appeal and its enduring appeal. The story itself is not just an opportunity for Dickens to meditate perhaps on the true meaning of Christmas. It's also an entertainment. It's a festive entertainment, very much in the line of festive ghost stories. It is, of course, a ghost story. We have four ghosts rather, appearing in the story, if we include the ghost of Marley, of course. This part of the appeal, I think, of the story is to sort of give a sense, really, of a life beyond the life that we exist in on a day-to-day basis. And again, I think that's possibly part of the story's appeal. This is a story which emphasizes the particular appeal and the special nature, really, of the festive period. It's a time, of course, when we do depart from our daily routines, hopefully, and perhaps meditate on the year that has gone by, as well as the years and year to come. And I think, in particular, the appeal of A Christmas Carol as a narrative perhaps might even be greater this year because of the troubled times that we have been living through over the past couple of years. And I think we all will take a pause at this particular Christmas to think about what has been taking place in our lives. This, of course, is precisely what Ebenezer Scrooge himself does, or is rather forced to do. But nonetheless, it's a process and an experience, a process of character development, which for Scrooge carries with it the possibility of redemption, not only by causing him to really reflect upon his past conduct and his past actions, but also giving him the opportunity through the supernatural device of the story to see into his future. And of course, he sees very clearly that his reputation and his future are very much out of sync with what he himself would like it to be, and how he himself would like to be remembered. So, to set the scene really for A Christmas Carol, there are a number of things really that feed into the composition of the story. First of all, I suppose on a basic level, Charles Dickens needed some money at the time that A Christmas Carol was written, and in particular, Dickens and his wife Catherine were expecting their fifth child. They were beset by a number of requests for money from his family in particular, and they also had a large mortgage on their house at Devonshire Terrace in London. Additionally, Dickens' cash flow problems were compounded by a drop in sales of the monthly instalments of Martin Chuzzlewit, which had actually left Charles Dickens with some cash flow problems. And I think, again, if we're thinking about the Dickensian experience of Christmas, specifically Charles Dickens' experience of Christmas, I think this is obviously a time of year when a lot of us might also experience similar cash flow difficulties. But again, the significant thing and the appealing thing about A Christmas Carol, perhaps something for us to think about, and this is again something we can discuss in the chat following this talk, is the sense in which this story lifts us out of our daily lives, our daily cares, and our daily concern with business affairs, financial affairs. And again, this is reflected through the character of Ebenezer Scrooge, this miserly, curmudgeonly character. Indeed, Scrooge, as I'm sure you're all aware, has become a synonym for a curmudgeonly character. It's an adjective which is often bandied about whenever somebody is stingy or mean-spirited. The particular seeds, however, of the story reflect very much Dickens' sense of a social conscience. And again, this is where Scrooge as a character becomes so significant to us, I think. Dickens, in particular, was very concerned, as you will know, with the social conditions of Victorian England, and was very preoccupied with ways in which they might be improved. And we can see that spirit of improvement very clearly in A Christmas Carol, not just on a personal level in terms of the character in particular of Ebenezer Scrooge, but on a social level as well. There's a very clear sense in which Dickens feels that the spirit of Christmas in some way has become obscured by commerce and the accumulation of capital. And in particular, Dickens was concerned with the plight of workers. And in the run-up to the period when Dickens was working on A Christmas Carol, Dickens found himself in Manchester, where he was meant to give a speech to support the Athenaeum there, which was an institution which provided adult education for manufacturing workers. And the idea of education as a way of improving oneself and of combating crime and poverty and the various things that Dickens could see afflicting society in the 1840s, very much provided the impetus for Dickens to produce a story of improvement. And Dickens himself became very engrossed with the purpose of improvement when he was writing A Christmas Carol. And he claimed himself that as he was writing the story, he laughed and wept and wept again, and that he actually took long walks around the streets of London at night in contemplation of the story and its themes. So Dickens became very heavily invested with the spirit of A Christmas Carol as he was working on it, and it was eventually published just before Christmas in 1843 and became an instant hit. Although we might want to note that Dickens' cash flow problems weren't entirely resolved because the sales of the story were not quite as high as he had anticipated. And this problem was compounded by the fact that almost instantaneously, because of the lax copyright laws of the time, a number of pirated editions were immediately produced. And this itself, of course, gives us the first inkling that A Christmas Carol is a text which might be defined by its constant reproduction. And that almost begins really from its moment of initial publication, much to Dickens' chagrin, I should add. And Dickens, in fact, ended up spending almost as much money fighting to suppress pirated editions of A Christmas Carol as he did in terms of making profit from it. So yeah, there's a bit of an irony there, perhaps. But nonetheless, I think even Dickens himself couldn't perhaps have realised quite how popular his very vivid and engrossing tale of redemption would endure beyond his own time, certainly beyond his own lifetime. And the story became a particular favourite during Dickens' renowned public readings, which he would undertake in support of various causes, and also which he was able to earn money from as well. And these public readings were immensely popular, and the first of them, which featured A Christmas Carol, was in fact given in Birmingham, and this is actually Dickens' first public reading. It was given in Birmingham Town Hall to the Industrial and Literary Institute on the 27th of December 1853. It was 10 years after the initial publication of A Christmas Carol. And this was very quickly repeated again to an audience of working people, and was a great success and was lauded in the press of the time. This particular suitability that A Christmas Carol had for public readings again perhaps gives us an indication that the novel was written to entertain as well as improve. It's clearly a text which fits into this sort of mid-Victorian fireside tradition of storytelling at Christmas, which again I think is a custom that perhaps some people might still even today maintain. But the story itself has become therefore encapsulated by the ideas of festive conviviality and sociability, and therefore in a sense it has become inextricably linked from this idea of a true spirit of Christmas, the one perhaps which Ebenezer Scrooge becomes converted to during the course of the story. So Dickens' tradition of reading the story was one of the key ways in which Christmas Carol became embedded in the public imagination. People became very familiar with it very quickly. If they hadn't read it, they might have heard Dickens reading it. And this in public interest in the story, which of course was bound to occur on an annual basis, or reoccur or re-emerge on an annual basis. This public interest was repeated time and time again over successive years. Very quickly, there were theatrical productions of A Christmas Carol. So one adaptation in particular occurred at the Surrey Theatre on the 5th of February 1844, and it was actually hot on the heels of the publication of the story, and again was an immense success. And this was sort of followed up by numerous theatrical stage productions of A Christmas Carol. There have even been Christmas Carol ballet productions, but perhaps it's on the screen that Dickens' timeless classic has become most embedded, perhaps, in the popular imagination. And in thinking about the appeal of Dickens on the screen, we might want to think about Scrooge as a central part in that. So the character of Ebenezer Scrooge has really given actors over the years a very good opportunity to portray a miserly character. And I'd suggest perhaps that the figure of Scrooge himself, on the basis that perhaps everybody finds a villain appealing in some way, the figure of Scrooge himself is an essential ingredient to the enduring popularity of A Christmas Carol, because he gives us an opportunity, partly, I suppose, to make us feel, hopefully, better about ourselves, in the sense that we perhaps don't identify with him, or shouldn't. And I think in stave one, obviously, Christmas Carol is divided into sections called staves, and there are 5 of them. But we get a really detailed description from Dickens of the character of Scrooge quite early on in A Christmas Carol. He's described as being, quote, a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his coffee in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. And then Dickens goes on to describe the extent to which Scrooge is impervious to warmth in general, really. Where he writes, external heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him only in one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." So this clearly Dickens, in his characterization of Scrooge, lays it on pretty thickly there. But I think this idea of Scrooge as the antithesis of the Christmas spirit, and his, of course, subsequent journey to redemption and warmth and conviviality is at the heart of the enduring appeal, not only to readers, but also to filmmakers, directors, and anyone else who is interested in what is essentially a very good yarn. As a counterpoint to the miserly nature of Scrooge that we encounter very early on in the story, we also might turn to A Christmas Carol as being a overly sentimental, perhaps, but nonetheless quintessential depiction of Christmas and what it represents. And this emerges again in Scrooge's discussion in the story of Christmas with his nephew Fred, who challenges Scrooge's hostility towards the festive season. And Fred does this by suggesting that, quote, "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas among the rest, but I'm sure I've always thought of Christmas time when it has come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin. If anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." This, of course, echoes the blessing of Tiny Tim that occurs at the end of the story. But of course, Scrooge, needless to say, is not convinced at this point. Although the clerk, though Dickens mentions that, quote, "The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded, becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety," i.e. Scrooge's gaze, "he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever." So again, we have this contest really going on, I think, between the spirit of Christmas and the impervious, miserly nature of Scrooge as a character, established very early on. And this tension is, of course, at the heart of the whole story. As I mentioned before, part of the, I think, appeal of A Christmas Carol lies in its engagement with the supernatural, with supernatural elements. And of course, these occur very vividly at night when Scrooge is awoken from his slumbers by various ghostly visitations. In particular, the visitation here, as we can see on the slide, from the Ghost of Christmas Past is very vividly described, I think. And again, this gives an opportunity for film directors and people interested in adapting the story to really kind of use their imaginations as they reinterpret the story. And of course, it also engages very heavily the imagination of readers as well. But Dickens tells us of the Ghost of Christmas Past. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished into a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, and the hands were the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright clear jet of light, by which all was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its dull moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. So here we have, in a sense, an embodiment not only of a ghostly apparition before Scrooge, but of course the embodiment of the spirit, a literal spirit, I suppose, of Christmas itself. a kind of almost angelic figure, pure in appearance, confounding to the understanding of Scrooge, but significantly bathed in a kind of light, a light perhaps of redemption. And again, this really kind of emphasizes the kind of spirit of Christmas, I think, as Dickens saw it. The possibility that one might reflect on one's behaviour and make a change to one's ways at this time of year. Of course, there is an impetus within the story for Scrooge to do this. When Scrooge is visited later on in the story by the ghost of Christmas yet to come, he is pointed, when he inquires about his own future, towards a churchyard. And we're told that here then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite, a worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape. Before I draw nearer to that stone to which he points, said Scrooge, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of the things that may be only? Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if persevered in, they must lead, said Scrooge. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me. The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. So here in particular, it's the terrifying realization that seizes Scrooge, which we can account for his alteration in his character. But the spirits, as they appear to Scrooge, essentially hold up a mirror to him and offer him the possibility, at least, that he might be wise to change his ways and to really embrace, if you like, the spirit of Christmas as Dickens portrays it. And of course, the prospect of Scrooge's own mortality and the sense of in which his grave is neglected is a very good impetus for that. And that change, that alteration in Scrooge's character, is particularly vividly portrayed by Dickens. And again, this is part of the catharsis that occurs in the story. We have this revulsion, perhaps, at Scrooge, as well as a fascination in terms of his character. Moments of genuine supernatural terror and anxiety about the future. But then this gives way, I think, to joy, really, and a sense of being able to recognise one's own faults. And this, of course, is very vividly depicted by Dickens when Scrooge emerges from bed the following morning, exclaiming, "Yes!" And the bedpost was his own, the bed was his own, the room was his own, best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. And then, of course, Scrooge exclaims that I will live in the past, the present, and the future, and then scrambles out of bed. The spirits of all three shall strive within me, he says. O Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, old Jacob on my knees. He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. They are not torn down, cried Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arms. They are not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will. His hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance. I don't know what to do, cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath, and making a perfect Laocoon of himself with his stockings. I am as light as a feather. I am as happy as an angel. I am merry as a schoolboy. I am giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hallo here, whoop, hallo. Now, we might not all leap out of bed on Christmas morning with the same gusto, but nonetheless, I think there is something very identifiable in Scrooge's embracing, perhaps, of the idea of Christmas at this point. Not least because, as I've mentioned, Christmas in A Christmas Carol seems to represent a sort of a taking of leave from the drudgeries of daily life, which I'm sure we'll all appreciate this year, perhaps more than other years. But of course, the things that Scrooge has been lacking, such as conviviality, a sense of warmth, have finally become available to him as a character because he has opened himself to these possibilities. And so, really, I think as I draw this short presentation, to a close, I think we can trace the popularity of A Christmas Carol and its appeal to various film directors, theatre directors, actors, and just anyone who's interested in engaging with Dickens' work. We can trace that appeal to the vivid characterizations, the story of redemption, which is constantly appealing, I think, to readers of the story, and its encapsulation of an idea of Christmas, which is in some way more meaningful than the world of commerce and materialism, perhaps, which we ourselves are all immersed in. And I think it's interesting. Well, we can discuss what people's sort of particular favourite adaptations of A Christmas Carol are, perhaps in the comments. But it is worth noting, perhaps, that as the years have gone by, A Christmas Carol has been readapted for different historical moments to reflect the concerns of particular times. But I think actually, in terms of thinking of our own time, the difference between now and the time in which Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol are perhaps not as great as we might imagine. And I think, again, that's an important part of the enduring appeal of A Christmas Carol. So I'll leave it there for now, and we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much for that, Dan. I'm feeling suitably festive now after listening to that presentation. Thank you. We're going to open up now, everyone, for questions, comments, discussion. If you haven't found it yet, the way to access the chat is to, again, click that purple icon. It's just sticking out the right-hand corner of your screen, and then you'll see a small speech bubble, and you'll be able to put any questions or comments in there. A good idea would be to also share your favourite film adaptations, and we can kind of discuss those. But to kick us off on the film vein, I'll ask you, Dan, what's your opinion on the masterful adaptation that is A Muppet's Christmas Carol?
I do love it. I'm subjected to it every year. My father is a particular fan of it, intriguingly enough, and I think in particular, I think the kind of the sense of kind of joyfulness of A Muppet Christmas Carol is enhanced by the kind of musical element to it as well. I think that it is a narrative which is enhanced by, I suppose, the kind of joyfulness of song, really, or the joyfulness that song can contribute. So I think, and of course, we have lots of well, the Muppets themselves are quite engaging characters with personalities of their own, and they do sort of translate very well into Dickens' story. Of course, when you have Michael Caine, of course, who is a very excellent Scrooge in that. So yeah, I think that A Muppet Christmas Carol is a classic, undoubtedly, and I do watch it quite regularly. Not every Christmas, perhaps.
You would have broken my heart if you said you didn't like it. So I'm really glad that was your answer. That's a firm favourite in our family. We've got, next question is, in your view, which actor best encapsulates the character of Scrooge?
My personal favourite portrayal of Scrooge is Alastair Sim in the 1951 film version. Although, having said that, I think the portrayal that Alec Guinness gave as well in I think it was 1970-ish. There was an adaptation that around then. I can't remember the exact year, but both of those actors I think really captured sort of the steeliness and the sort of miserliness of Scrooge. I think in a sense it's it's important to be able to do that because as I say, I think the kind of the detachment of Scrooge from society is something that is very important to kind of emphasise if you're in a portrayal. It's also part of the fascination with Scrooge. How can a character, of course, become so so detached like that? And of course, the story does explore perhaps reasons why that occurred, and the sense in which Scrooge is able to sort of break away from that as a character is a positive trajectory, and again, it represents the ideas of improvement that I think Dickens had at the forefront of his imagination when he's writing the story.
That's great, thank you. The next question is, I have an edition of the book which John Leech illustrates. I get the impression that they must have known each other, as the illustrations really embody Dickens' message.
Yeah, I think those Leech illustrations, which appeared in the first edition, also had a very profound effect on the way in which the story was envisaged. But I think I agree. I think Leech was very good at interpreting the kind of and visualizing the kind of scenes that Dickens put into the story, and really kind of gave the story a kind of atmosphere, which I think a lot of subsequent adaptations have sought to replicate. And so I think this is true of a lot of the illustrations actually that accompany Dickens' works. They have in a sense kind of solidified our understanding of Dickens, of particular scenes, with particularly famous scenes, along with, of course, the readings and the vivid portrayals that Dickens himself gave in the readings of his stories. They have really kind of, I think those two things, the illustrations and the public readings, really embedded a wide range of Dickens characters in the public imagination, perhaps like no other author, I suspect. And yes, absolutely, is just reading the comments there. There's certainly enough detail, yes, to inspire theatrical and cinema portrayals. Absolutely right. I think that's it.
That's great. Thank you very much. I've kind of got another one. I was thinking about you were talking about the ghost story aspect, and I think people, I do anyway. You kind of forget initially that it is a ghost story. That is at the heart of it is a ghost story. And that the ghost story on Christmas Eve is sort of, is quite famous as a Christmas tradition. Do you know if that was something that has happened for many, many years, or is that something that is very much in this work?
So yeah, I think there are a number of kind of interesting things about, again, I suppose the relationship between Dickens and the traditions of Christmas. So in the 1840s, when Dickens produced A Christmas Carol, there was the Christmas, the traditions that we associate with Christmas hadn't really kind of been revived fully yet. And Dickens is plays an instrumental role in doing that. And I think I suppose the traditions of sort of fireside conviviality perhaps are embedded in Christmas because it is a winter festival. People actually are indoors, and in days before kind of television and Netflix and things like that, people would perhaps tell stories, and they might exchange folk stories of ghosts and supernatural happenings. So it's kind of easy to see what sort of prior to Dickens really, and prior to sort of the emergence of Gothic fiction, where sort of this tradition could have come from. So I think it's something that's kind of always been there, and obviously subsequent to Dickens, I think it became in the later Victorian period much more of a kind of a Christmas tradition. I would say, of course, M.R. James and his ghost stories are very much framed in that kind of Victorian fireside tradition as well, and even Henry James, of course, with his Turn of the Screw, which I've had the pleasure of teaching this week, actually, quite appropriately as we come to the festive period. That's framed within a similar sort of idea of storytelling, and again that kind of suitability that a Christmas Carol has for performance is embedded there in the text. So it's very much, you can sort of see how it lends itself to these adaptations and performances.
Absolutely. We've had a comment from Jane saying, I've only ever seen the Blackadder interpretation, which is very entertaining. Yes, it is very entertaining, Jane. If you haven't seen that, everyone, you really need to go and try and track it down. It is excellent. Another thing I was kind of thinking about was, how would you, as somebody who's more of an expert in this field, how would you compare A Christmas Carol to Dickens' other work? I mean, arguably this is the most famous of his works, but how do you think the quality of it compares to other books he's written?
Well, I think A Christmas Carol, of course, is part of a sort of canon of Christmas literature that Dickens produced. He produced other a number of other Christmas stories. I've got my copy of Dickens' Christmas stories right here, in fact, on my desk. Stories like The Chimes, Cricket on the Hearth. These are other kind of very, very well known Christmas stories produced by Dickens, and again, perhaps eclipsed in terms of their fame by Christmas Carol, but nonetheless they're part of a kind of body of work that Dickens obviously did produce, which really kind of echoes some of the key ideas that we find in A Christmas Carol in terms of sort of kind of the meaning or significance of Christmas, not just for individuals perhaps, but on a kind of social level as well. Again, I think Dickens is always interested in the kind of social, the possibility that Christmas can actually have social good, rather than just being a kind of a party, which of course we do get in A Christmas Carol. Lots of turkeys and again fireside conviviality. But I suppose also in some of Dickens' novels as well, we find allusions to Christmas which chime very strongly with what we find in A Christmas Carol. So I was teaching A Tale of Two Cities actually fairly recently, and I've forgotten that there was quite an evocative depiction of Christmas or reference to Christmas in that. Which sort of was relevant. It would be relevant if to a comparison with A Christmas Carol, Dickens kind of returns to the idea of Christmas repeatedly in his work. So it's not just a kind of novelty that he explores in his writing.
And do you think that this particular story, A Christmas Carol, is something that will continue to be adapted on screen and on stage for many years to come?
Absolutely, yes. In fact, only a couple of years ago, there was a new Dickens adaptation by the BBC, which was launched, which was greeted with great fanfare, and I think a lot of people tuned in on Christmas Day to watch it. So again, I think that's a kind of testament to its kind of enduring appeal. Again, I can't really sort of see it going out of fashion at this time of the year, even though perhaps people don't. I mean, I can see maybe people don't read Dickens quite as much as perhaps they used to do. But it's certainly in terms of Christmas, I think that the idea of Christmas and A Christmas Carol in particular is just now embedded, inextricably linked.
Absolutely. The next question is, if Dickens chose to do his public readings into a predominantly working class audience, was the book also a political statement about the terrible poverty of London in the 1840s?
I think it is. I think it is it is clearly a text which is influenced by profoundly political concerns. It's about the kind of Scrooge's miserly nature is sort of I think identified by Dickens as part of the kind of root cause, if you like, of social ills, or at least the possibility that that things could be done about the ills of Victorian Britain, particularly in the cities, and that people weren't willing to kind of do anything about them. So it's Scrooge's kind of indifference to other people, really, as framed by his sort of hostility towards Christmas as a sort of as a festive occasion, that is a kind of indication of his callousness, really. And Dickens, I think, definitely does sort of think that's indicative of a wider social problem. And I think, again, sort of the idea that there might be something socially kind of redemptive in Dickens' idea of Christmas is quite an important one here.
Elizabeth is asking, did Dickens end up financially sound, or did he constantly struggle? And Jane has commented that he left his wife and kids, I believe, for his lover. So do you have any idea if he ended up financially sound in the end?
Yes, he did. I think he bought his dream house, and he made a lot of money. He was really a very successful professional writer, and wasn't the first. I think that accolade probably would have to go to Sir Walter Scott, who made a lot of money from his novels, but also lost a lot of money and had to pay it back. But Scott was able to make a lot of money from fiction, and Dickens was too. Dickens also made a lot of money from public readings and things as well. So he was able to achieve financial security. But in 1843, he's still got quite a way to go in his career. So I think he possibly overextended himself. Dickens, yes, did leave his wife and kids unfortunately, it's not the most glorious episode perhaps in Dickens' life. Yes, he was certainly not very far from being an ideal husband, I would say, in that sense. So, and Claire Tomalin, in her recent biography of Dickens, actually has some quite interesting things to say, I think, about Dickens' marriage to Catherine and its ending. But yes, that's all very true.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I think that might be it for questions. If anybody has anything else, that comes to mind, you've still got time. If you've got anything that springs to mind, please do feel free to type it in. We'll give you another minute to see if you can think. And also, haven't had that many comments about everyone's favourite version, which I'm quite surprised about, because I need some inspiration. My family only watches Muppets Christmas Carol every year.
Right. There are a lot to choose from, I suppose. But yeah, I suppose there are sort of various different sort of forms of adaptation. So I suppose you get the sort of very faithful period adaptations of not just A Christmas Carol, but of Dickens' works more generally. But I suppose A Christmas Carol is the one that's adapted more. So obviously the Bill Murray kind of retelling, Scrooged, is quite a popular one as well. And that tends to crop up on people's TV screens at Christmas time. But there have been sort of various other incarnations. It sort of lends itself to different settings, to different periods, because of course it is a story which deals with some pretty fundamental questions about who we are and how we relate to other people, and the idea that we might be capable of changing our ways, which is always quite a sort of nice idea, I suppose, if we find fault in ourselves or our conduct. So nice to be able to think we can make amends.
Absolutely. And just to point out to everybody there that my colleague Gary has actually put a link to, we're having a virtual celebration of carols at watch party next week. We've put together a recording with some lovely readings and songs, and if you'd like to come along and watch that live, then you can do so. He's put the link to register in the chat there. I'm just seeing if there's any other questions. Really love Christmas Carol, so have enjoyed the session. Are you planning to do this again with a different book? I think basically they're asking, will you come back another time, Dan?
Yes, I'm going to have a rest probably over the festive period, but I'm quite happy to come back and do further presentations in the future if people are interested in that, and there's demand for it. Yes, the George C. Scott version I just noted, that's a very good one as well, actually. Yeah, that's another good. There are lots of really quite good adaptations. I think Patrick Stewart was a good Scrooge as well, actually. He did about 20 years ago, I think he did a version of A Christmas Carol, which was particularly well judged, I think. But yeah, absolutely happy to return myself though, and yeah, speak on another topic perhaps.
That's what we like to hear. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I think that's maybe everything then. Thank you so much, Dan, for
No
giving us
problem. And can I wish everyone online a very happy Christmas and New Year, and a relaxing festive period as well, because I think we probably will need one. I don't know.
Absolutely. I think everyone's looking forward to a break. Yes, and thank you to everybody who joined us this afternoon. It's really lovely to see so many of you here. And I'll just echo what Dan said. I hope you have a lovely Christmas, and we'll see you for more events next year, hopefully. So have a lovely evening or afternoon or morning, wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you again very soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks everyone. Bye now. Thanks.